Hello and welcome back. I'm Alexander Shelley, Music Director of Canada's National Arts Centre Orchestra, and this is our 5th video on conducting technique. I hope you've enjoyed the previous videos. If you haven't seen them yet, do take a look back because I'm going to be building on some of the aspects that I discussed in the last few of them. That includes right hand stick technique, the basics of how we move and use the right hand, and in the last videos I introduced the left hand and how we can work with it and use it. In this video, I'm going to focus on phrasing and how we can indicate that using our right and our left hands. We're going to use a simple melody, Mary Had a Little Lamb, to help us along the way. And I'm going to talk, first of all, about how we use this hand, the right hand, our main beating hand, to indicate these shapes. When we talk about phrasing, we always have to have something in mind. We have to say, where are we going to or where are we coming from? That's the essence of a phrase. Are we saying, Mary had a little lamb? Or are we saying, Mary had a little lamb? Are we emphasizing the lamb, or are we emphasizing Mary? We could also emphasize, Mary had a little lamb. That would be a different kind of phrasing. At the moment, I'm only talking about one bar, really. It's not truly a phrase. But within that bar, there's the shaping. And the essence of how we phrase is to be found in just that simple structure. So let's talk about it. If we said, Mary has a little lamb, we're saying that there's an emphasis in the bar and there's a release in the bar. Now, a very simple way to indicate that is by beating the emphasized beat a little stronger and then giving less on the following beats. Mary had a little lamb. If we're in 4/4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Mary had a little lamb. Now, you'll see in this shape, I'm doing some very simple things. Big amplitude on the emphasized beat of Mary, a smaller amplitude on the second, third, and fourth. Also, I start the beat far away from my body, indicating that there's a depth to the sound and a weight to the sound. And as I move through the bar, I come into my body, which lightens the gesture. Mary had a little lamb. Mary had a little lamb. If we go to the lamb, we could say, Mary had a little lamb. Mary had a little lamb. This is indicating a little crescendo into it, or a strengthening into it. But you'll see that the essence is the same. We start, in that case, smaller, we increase the amplitude, and we move away from the body. So in the first example, first beat is heavy, Mary had a little lamb. And the second example, the last beat is heavy, Mary had a little lamb. Now, what do we do if we want to emphasize had? Well, it's the same thing. We give a bigger amplitude on the second beat, a little bit more impulse, and we move away from it and into the body. Mary had a little lamb. So, the three versions. Mary had a little lamb. Mary had a little lamb. Mary had a little lamb. If you want to get used to the basic of that feeling, just imagine hitting the word that you like. Mary had a little lamb. Mary had a little lamb. Mary had a little lamb. And this is where we introduce another option, which is to say we keep the beat consistent here. We don't change the amplitude or the impulse, but we use the left hand instead. We could say, Mary had a little lamb. Mary had a little lamb. This gesture indicates opening the sound stronger away from the body and coming into the body to show that we're getting softer and that it's less important. Mary had a little lamb. Mary had a little lamb. Mary had a little lamb. Again, if I wanted to crescendo, Mary had a little lamb. We take the gestures that we talked about in the left-hand video of crescendo, diminuendo, and we include them in the service of the phrasing of this bar. Now, that's talking about Mary had a little lamb in 4/4, and it's just talking about the phrasing of this one bar. But let's talk, while we're in the one bar, about what happens if we're beating in 8. Within our coordinates of 1, 2, 3, and 4, we talked about having a subdivision in our minds. 1, and 2, and 3, and 4, and. And ultimately, when we beat 8, 8, so indicating all the eighth notes, that's all we do. We subdivide in our mind where the eighth notes are and give them an impulse. I'll show you a slow 4 and then an 8 in the same tempo. 1, 2, 3, 4, and now we add impulses. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and or 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. You can follow the plane that I'm using there, which we've been practicing over the last few videos, and you can see how I'm using my wrist and my elbow also to indicate these subdivisions. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Now, why do I mention this? Well, if we were taking the theme Mary Has a Little Lamb slowly and wanted to indicate within this 8/8 how we're phrased, we use the same skills. Mary had a little lamb. Mary had a little lamb. You see the way it works. We could pick out any one of those 8th notes, keeping the right hand independent, and move towards it with the left hand, show where the emphasis is, and move away. And if we're just using the right hand, Mary had a little lamb. Mary had a little lamb. Again, you pick out the 8th note that you want emphasized, and you give a bigger gesture towards it. If we wanted to crescendo towards it, we would increase bit by bit the amplitude until the 8th note that we want to emphasize. Mary had a little lamb. If we wanted a diminuendo, Mary had a little lamb. So the principles remain the same. We're using the amplitude of these planes. We're using impulse to indicate crescendo, diminuendo, and then where we should have the emphasis in the bar. Of course, we can do this across several bars. Mary had a little lamb, little lamb, little lamb. We're indicating there with a long gesture in the left hand that over several bars we're maintaining a line. We can do the opposite. Little lamb, little lamb. We can take the tension out using the left hand. And with the right hand, exactly the same. Mary had a little lamb, little lamb, little lamb. Mary had a little lamb. And so on and so forth. So with the amplitude and with the impulse, we can show direction. But you need to have it in mind. You need to have prepared the score in a way that is clear to you, where all these different lines lead, so that you're able to express that to an orchestra. So that builds on what we talked about in the last couple of videos. What I'd like to talk about next with you in our next video is how to prepare those scores, how to think about how you phrase and how you learn, basically, for when you get in front of an orchestra.